Wade woke in the middle of the night with a need for a drink. He stood next to his bed with a pounding headache, his mind empty of all thoughts but one. Where am I going to get some booze? He took to the kitchen of his meager hotel room, checking the empty refrigerator, knowing what would greet him there. He looked through the small space for some sort of indication of alcohol, a minibar, perhaps a pantry, but there was nothing. Wade thought of the last place he had been before he had fallen asleep the night before. Dave's. The bartender slept above his small tavern. He likely had something. Wade pulled on a pair of pants, too nice to sleep in, too ratty for business. He pocketed his wallet and he left. The bar was open, surprisingly. A small lamp shone in one of the windows, casting a slight warm glow outside. The wind was chilly, and Wade stepped inside, expecting the warmth of the fire that emanated from one corner of the room in the daytime. The fire was not there. The light was not there. He took his lighter from his pocket, instinctively reaching for the pack of cigarettes in the opposite pocket, before staying his hand. The lighter was bright, but it did not cut through the darkness nearly well enough. With slow steps, he strode through the tavern, around the bar, to the stairs that led to Dave's room. But there was a light. Dim, it came from a crack in the doorway to his right. He pushed the door open, slowly, and inside was Dave. He sat, kneeling on the floor, a pitcher in his left hand, a blade in his right. Without warning, he dumped the contents of the pitcher onto the floor, the water splashing almost silently. He did not seem to notice the light coming from Wade's lighter. Dave took the blade's point, sliding it under his eye, first his left, then his right. Blood poured from the gashes, drops at a time. No moaning or pain escaped him, and Wade could not muster the will to move. Both out of fear and, to his horror, curiosity. Where each drop of blood hit the small puddle, a small light appeared. Stars. A puddle of stars. With a sudden movement, Dave lowered his face to the star-filled water, and inexplicably, his nose did not contact the wood floor, but instead passed through the water until his face had been submerged up to his ears. At this strange gesture, Wade finally came to his senses. He closed his lighter and ran to the submerged man. He tugged at Dave's shoulders, and yet it was as if the puddle had hands, millions of small hands gripping Dave's face, refusing to let go. The sound of the wind picking up, a step on the wood floor. Wade looked up to see a small, smiling man in front of him. But his face. His eyes were massive, too large, it seemed, for his face to hold them. His pupils were just as massive, and the whites of his eyes seemed non-existent, as did his nose. Directly beneath his eyes was a smiling mouth, but not a smile that engendered any form of happiness or comfort. A horrendous smile that tugged at the small man's lips, revealing gray gums and teeth much too white to be true. His lips pulled to the side until they reached his ears. Wade stood up, out of surprise and fear, his hands no longer on Dave's shoulders. As he rose, he expected the dwarf creature in front of him, but instead, the small man grew as well. So tall that his head seemed almost to pass through the ceiling, and he bent over. His smile directed straight at Wade. More wind. Suddenly, he was all around, 1,000 smiling faces, 2,000 smiling eyes that looked but did not see. The now large man simply stared. Wade returned to Dave and began to heave, staring at the smiling men, wanting out of this torturous dream. With a great pull, Dave was hoisted out of the puddle and came to lie with his face resting on Wade's knee. Wade looked down, hoping to find some comfort in a familiar face. Instead, he paled. Dave's face was no longer familiar. It no longer seemed to be a face at all. Where there was originally his mouth, his nose, they were dozens upon dozens of blue eyes, matching the two in the center of his face. His hair had fallen off, and he was pale, white. Wade's repulsion was apparent in the tears of horror that he shed, and, though there was no mouth to speak of on that face of the creature he held in his arms, he could hear, more in his mind than anywhere else, Dave's voice, raspy but clear. "Finally, I can see, truly see." The wind picked up a third time, the lapping of ocean water on a beach. Dave was gone. The large men were gone. The light was gone. The floor was gone. Wade was gone. The cosmos closed in from all angles. Dark, blue, purple, black. In the outskirts of his mind, Wade heard a voice. It spoke like the wind and looked like the ocean. "I see you." Wade woke screaming, the scars under his eyes aching painfully. There's a sway in the tall grass ahead, ever so slightly to the right. The wind isn't blowing, nor the earth shaking, but the grass sways and parts all the same. Perhaps it's some tiny creature scampering about for food. For the sun is low and the shadows long, and mice need to stock up before the nighttime. The tall grass sways back and forth in its own secluded spot all the same. Perhaps it's a sinkhole opening up to the nothingness below, deep in the earth, and into old ruins where men and things that were not men walked and tread and stamped. For the grass is very tall, up to your chest, with golden hues and seeds aplenty for the light to bounce off of. The tall grass shakes and stops and moves again, parting left, then right, then back, then again, then back. Perhaps it's a dog, a lone dog looking for its master, in pain and loneliness, trying to find a way out of this field that is far too large for its own good. Perhaps the dog is hurt and needs help, with a whimper and blood dripping, hoping nothing comes too close to the tall grass around it. Nothing hard to see or hard to run from, for the grass makes noises in that spot, such singular noises that grass does not usually make, no matter how tall and golden it might be. Perhaps it's a dog holding a rabbit still itching to escape the punctures in its back and the stinking of bone into its flesh, to create the deep pits to carve its fur from, while the dog, lively and strong and active and powerful, haunches over and eyes the surrounding grass that sways back and forth, wondering if something is going to try to snatch his rabbit away, or snatch him away. For the grass is tall and sways and glints and makes such noise in that place just ahead of you, and slightly to the right, that place that you cannot see from standing on your toes and cannot peer through far enough to look. For the gold and a tall that obscures your vision just enough to make it look like anything at all could be there, and making such quiet noise. Perhaps it's not a dog at all, but an ambush, a creature of scales and poison, small or larger than the field around it, slithering and scratching through, finding a place to burrow down until it's safe to move again, safe to hunt, safe to wrap and crush and devour with its massive teeth. For the tall grass is plentiful and could cover up anything that did not want to be found. so long as it was small and fast and agile, and blended into the crushed grass below, into the muddy dirt that sunk when it was trod upon by years and years and years of hunters and hunted. Perhaps it is an ancient type, a crocodile of massive proportions, or a panther that sees perfectly through the gold, or a little girl that's been lost for years in the tall grass, still looking for the parents that left her behind. For the grass is tall and hides many things when the wind blows and the sun sets. In this large field that nobody should go in, because nobody can see the way out. But the wind is not blowing and the sun has not set, so it's harder for things to run now. It's harder to run at all. And the swaying is getting closer. The figure grew in stature until he towered over Michael. Every inch of his face was shrouded with shadows that seemed to possess a mind of their own. He was hairless, and his presence seemed to make every light in the small room grow instantly dimmer. The creature bent forward until his soulless eyes hovered a few inches above Michael's face. "I am Nyarlathotep, the crawling chaos. You are but an ant before me, mortal. Bow down and render your service to your new master." Michael met the Black Pharaoh's gaze. "You're preaching to the choir, man, but I'm a little too busy to be rendering services to any masters at the moment." The primordial being opened his mouth and then closed it. Confusion etched into its smooth, dark face. "I am preaching to what?" Michael smiled. "It's an expression. It means that I agree with what you're saying. I totally am an inconsequential worm when compared to the vastness of an ever-expanding universe. My life is absolutely meaningless, and I'm simply wasting time until the day finally comes when I'll die." Nyarlathotep scratched his head. His carefully cultivated aura of terror and madness was unraveling, and he had no idea what he should do about it. If there's nothing else you need, Mr. Nyarlathotep, I really should be heading to class." Michael stood for another moment staring up at the pitch figure before him, but when he made no moves to stop him, Michael walked out of the room. Nyarlathotep remained where he was, watching Michael walk away from him. He was not a being that people walked away from, and this total indifference startled him. Michael sat in his apartment writing an essay on the nature of chivalry as presented by Arthurian literature in the Middle Ages. It was due at midnight, and he had procrastinated writing until 8 o'clock. A crumpled up Red Bull sat on the desk next to his laptop, leaking out leftover liquids onto a pile of hastily scrawled notes. Michael had 200 words remaining before he reached the required length, and time was running short. His fingers flew across the keyboard. Misspellings and grammar mistakes were growing in frequency. But he was too close now to worry. It was 11:50 p.m. when he submitted the essay. His hands were shaking with adrenaline and nerves, but the overwhelming sense of relief was palpable. He was one step closer towards achieving a history degree that would be useless for any future job. A strange sound in the kitchen drew Michael's attention away from his computer. Rising from his chair, he exited his bedroom to investigate. The apartment was filled with darkness. The curtains were drawn, and the few insignificant beams of moonlight that managed to penetrate the drapes were quickly smothered by the gloom. Thick shadows blocked out the light emanating from the bedroom behind Michael. It was as if a wall of blackness had been erected in the middle of the room. Michael stepped forward into this darkness. The adrenaline and nerves of his rushed assignment had come back in force. But this time, they spoke of a more corporeal and primitive danger than academic failure. His heart pounded as shadows engulfed him, drowning out all vision. The further he moved into the room, the more isolated he became, until it was as if Michael floated on a teetering raft in the middle of a black sea. Leather creaked and whispered in the darkness. All around could be heard the soft flapping of mammalian wings. Michael's solitude had disappeared as suddenly as the light. He was surrounded by creatures born out of the deepest and darkest recesses of divine imagination. Michael kept walking, but his movement was no longer his control. His legs shook and wavered, but some indomitable will steered him deeper and deeper into the void. His bare feet touched cold tile, and a shiver crawled up his spine. He was in the kitchen now. He felt himself engulfed by whatever power had possessed his apartment. A thin beam of light appeared before Michael, widening as a heavy door opened, until it shone in his face like the countenance of God. He fell to his knees. A figure stepped forward, dazzling and radiant. "Arise, slave, and let your worm mind wrap itself around my glory," said the being in the light. Its voice rang with authority. Michael stood, his legs quaking beneath him. His eyes were downcast, unable to focus for long on the unfiltered glory of the light. The divinity stepped forward, lifting Michael's chin with a ready hand. Michael looked up into the face of his new god, marveling at the statuesque vision before him. The face was almost featureless, holding nothing but thin eyes and lips. The skin was smooth ebony, ageless and firm. Nyarlathotep smiled down at Michael. The mortal quivered beneath his gaze. This was the reaction he expected and relished. He could feel the tendrils of insanity crawling into Michael's mind, infecting him with the eldritch horror of unlimited cosmos. In a few moments, the writhing human would surrender the entirety of his being. Nyarlathotep, and then this game would be finished. The Black Pharaoh gloated, savoring every second that drew him closer to completion. Time drew on, turning seconds into minutes. The dominance of Michael's mind was proceeding. But progress had slowed to a crawl. He still writhed and cowered beneath Nyarlathotep's gaze, but the light in his eyes seemed to shine brighter with every moment that passed. The suffocating blackness of the room was receding, and distant sounds could be heard from the street. Nyarlathotep doubled down on his efforts, but the strength of Michael's mind kept him at bay. "This is impossible. I have conquered entire continents, and the men that ruled them. His brain should be melting out of his ears at this point." The clock on the microwave flashed 1 a.m., and Michael yawned. He reached up and rubbed his eyes with both hands, stretching his spine as he moved. A bright square of light emanating from the open refrigerator illuminated the apartment. Michael stepped forward to shut the door, grumbling under his breath about wasting electricity, when he noticed the figure stooping before him. How did you get in here?" Nyarlathotep shook his head and brushed past Michael to plop down on the couch. "Excuse me?" said Michael. "What the hell is happening?" Michael closed the fridge door and then reached over to flip on the lights. The fluorescent bulbs flickered and then shone down on the shadowy personage that huddled on the couch. "Oh shit, you're that guy from earlier. Nyarlathotep or something like that. How'd you get in here, man?" Nyarlathotep looked up with weary eyes. "How did you resist me? My very gaze should have flayed your spirit." Michael shrugged. "No offense, man, but I really don't know what you're talking about." "You do not remember me? I presented myself to you as a god. You bowed down before me with reverence in your eyes. And yet, Somehow you survived with your sanity intact. Michael sat down next to Nyarlathotep. He closed his eyes and did his best to remember. They sat in silence for several minutes, and then Michael laughed. If it makes you feel any better, you got pretty close. But why did I not squash your mind like a puny insect? You were trying to fill me with existential dread. And the knowledge that the universe is infinite and terrifying, right? Yes, said Nyarlathotep. I already know that. You can't pour water into a cup that's already full. My entire generation has been corrupted by the shit show that is our modern existence, so we really aren't scared of stuff like that anymore. I don't have time to think about cryptic alien gods when I'm too busy drowning in student debt. Nyarlathotep scratched his chin and nodded. So you are saying that humanity has already frightened its children and filled them with existential horror? Exactly, man. The world is fucking scary right now, and us kids are fucking broken because of it. If you want to scare anyone, go bother our grandparents. Nyarlathotep rose up from the couch. He held out his hand to Michael, who immediately returned the gesture and shook. I appreciate your aid, young Michael. Anytime, man. Feel free to come back. That hallucination stuff was pretty gnarly. It was way more vivid than any shrooms. The two said their farewells, and Nyarlathotep stepped back towards the window. He transformed into a bat with black, leathery wings and talons the size of butcher knives, and then he flew out of the window and into the night. Michael watched him disappear, and then turned and made his way to the fridge. Grabbing a pudding cup and a Dr. Pepper, he returned to his bedroom. Careful not to spill his snacks, he climbed into bed and turned on the TV. The third season of Stranger Things had just been added to Netflix, and he'd been looking forward to watching it all day. After hours of work, he finally did it. The boy that looked to be no older than 15 stepped back and looked upon his masterpiece. Or so he called it. It was what looked to be a summoning circle, complete with candles and offerings that the book said he'd need. All that was left to do was spill some of his blood on there and let everything else unfold. Carefully, he took a knife and pressed it to his skin, hard enough to draw blood, but not leave a permanent mark after it heals. It was almost as if he's done this before. As soon as the blood hit the outline of the circle, flames rose out of every line he drew on the pavement. After they died down, the teen could see a figure standing before him. He was much taller than the boy and wore a neatly kept suit, which would make anyone think he was just your average businessman. "Why have you summoned me?" the figure asked with a booming voice. "I want to make contact with you," the little boy replied softly. The man sneered and hissed. "What could a young man such as yourself possibly want from me, eh?" "A good reason to live," the boy replied in almost a whisper. He looked down as he said so and could only manage the saddest of smiles when he looked back up. "I hope that's not asking too much from you." The man regarded him with a thoughtful look. He could see now that the boy wasn't very neatly kept. His clothes were all tattered and his hair looked like it hadn't been washed in weeks. The man was just about to reply when he noticed something on the boy's arms. Quickly, he grabbed one of his arms and examined it with almost an angry expression as the boy tried to wiggle free from his grasp. "Why have you done this?" The man boomed, his face red with anger. "Who made you want to do this?" The boy, shocked, answered, "I'm only an inconvenience to people I love the most. I tried to take myself out of their lives many different ways, but everything just keeps getting worse." The boy looked up at the man and chuckled. "I figured if I summoned you, you could at the very least give me a reason to stay alive." The man pulled the boy up and hugged him tightly. After what seemed like forever, he finally asked, "Would you like to come back with me to the underworld? It's not as bad as you humans make it out to be, I promise. I've never raised a kid before, but I'm sure I'd be able to make you happy." The boy looked stunned at these words, but after processing what had just been said to him, he took the devil's hand with tears in his eyes and only nodded his head. The boy went and grabbed what few things he had and stepped into the circle, never to be seen again.